This past week, we heard a statement out of Wilmington, North Carolina. It gets harder and harder to be proud of that state. Well, actually, this past week hasn't been as bad. But we heard one statement by a presidential candidate who I won't name, who claimed that Second Amendment people might be the last ones who can stop if his opponent is elected president. Second Amendment people. The public reaction was swift and hard. How outrageous for someone to encourage the idea of an identity group founded on their guns. But for those of us from North Carolina, we know that the comment was anything but outrageous. Second Amendment people had done just that a little more than 100 years ago in Wilmington, a few miles from where this candidate spoke on Tuesday. It was 1898, and black Republicans and white populists had joined together in the state of North Carolina to build a fusion movement that took over every statewide office, including majorities in the state legislature and the governorship. At the time, Wilmington was the largest city, port city, with this fusion government, African-American leadership on the city council, and the only black-owned newspaper in the state. 20 years after the end of Reconstruction, all right, thank you. I think I'm all right. After Reconstruction, many of you will hear sometimes that, people say this is the first so-and-so since Reconstruction, the first African-American judge since Reconstruction. But you have to ask them, what time is that? Because Reconstruction, we know, ends 1877. This is 20 years after the federal troops have left. This is homegrown, grassroots, black and white people coming together and taking political power, a history that we can reclaim. But they came together to oppose the Democrats, who, of course, at the time was the Klan. They expanded labor rights, rights to participate in juries, expanded access to education, and most dangerously of all, they expanded the right to vote. Should I go off here? Sometimes I feel like I can't do technology. Off. All right, here we go. It's a little more comfortable anyway. This coalition could not be allowed to exist, so the people, the planner class of the day, created their own version of Second Amendment people called the Red Shirts. And the editors of the largest newspaper, published cartoons of black men pictured as demons attacking white women, warned white men of the danger of black rule in Wilmington, and a mob of over 2,000 white men forced the democratically elected city council, mayor, and other officers to step down at gunpoint in a coup d'etat. But that wasn't enough. They went on a rampage. They brought a Gatling gun in from Raleigh, and they murdered dozens, if not hundreds, of black people in open season in Wilmington. Over 2,000 black families fled the city. The city still hasn't recovered. Wilmington's the closest port to Africa. It would have been one of the largest ports in the South and in the entire country. But people decided that prosperity for everyone was not good enough. So when we hear about Second Amendment people, or other language like, I want to give back power to the Christian churches, we know they're not talking about this church. They're not talking about Church of the Open Door. Brooklyn, my pastor's here from that I interned under. One of the young kids up here helped me out saying, "Your hands are fantastic." He said, "No, your hands are shaking." I was like, okay. That's why I got my mentor here. They're not talking about our churches. We know what that language means, Christian church, and giving them power back. And so I come to this text today with a lot on my mind. At first I read it, all of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, God has prepared a city for them. And as I was thinking about this, and I had a great sermon together, I said, all right, this is what we need to talk about. How can we be a people who God is not ashamed of? I heard out of the corner of my ear, I have an idea. And one thing about being in a clergy couple is you never stop writing a sermon. And so Hershey from the shower told me, go find the lectionary where this text comes from. And so I stopped and I looked, and all of a sudden I realized that this is what is read every year on Independence Day. And I was like, oh, that's how they use this? That when in this country our theology has taught us that the United States is the city that God has prepared for us, that this is all there is. I was stopped in my tracks, and it dawned on me all over again how the myth of American exceptionalism permeates our everyday theology. And what I believe and would like to posit today is that the problem of white supremacy that we keep on running over and over into, every time we think it's gone, it smacks us right in the face again, that this is a theological problem. It is a problem of how we see ourselves and how we understand God. It is a theology passed on to us by what theologian Kelly Brown Douglas called Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, a myth that merged the stories of the Israelites and the Puritans, twisted the Exodus story, and made the New World, the Americas, into the Canaan, the promised land for Europeans. This was the promised land of Anglo-Saxon mythology, the city on the hill, manifest destiny, you've heard it all. And along the way, it joined forces with the narratives of Enlightenment, notions of science, reason, liberty, and so-called freedom, but a different type of freedom, a freedom that depended on the unfreedom of others. And you add to this a healthy dose of Renaissance art that monopolized human beauty and Greco-Roman art forms, white normativity and the pseudoscience of brain size, and we have a dangerous mix. Science, art, and theological justification. It created a society where to be human in this country meant to be white. And don't get it twisted, America in itself, as Toni Morrison has pointed out, is all cut up in whiteness. Only something as intricate as the melding of these interconnected dialogues and discourses sustained by our exploitation of workers could be pliable and creative enough to morph God's dream for humanity in the gospel of Jesus Christ into a nightmare for enslaved Africans and indigenous people in the New World. Only something this pliable. And if it's this pliable and morphable, it can always come back. And since white supremacy is itself a theology, this is for everyone. We're a multi-faith congregation, but you don't have to be Christian to be part of it. To be white in America means to have been poisoned by it, to be poisoned to white supremacy. And that's how you can end up with this beautiful scripture being read every Independence Day. But the genius of the Bible and the miracle of the scriptures in my mind is that in the very ancient texts that were written as revolutionary interruptions of the Roman Empire were so often embraced and reused and sustained by that very empire. 300 years after Jesus, the Roman Empire decides to take on the religion that was created to destroy it. You take our example today, we know little about the author or origin of Hebrews, but what we do know is that Hebrews was writing, whoever wrote this, and the title was added a couple hundred years later by someone with a pen who liked the title. But after it was written, the strongest argument is that the audience was in Rome, made up of a diverse group of Jewish and non-Jewish Jesus followers. No one would have had any idea of this stark distinction between the Jewish religion and the Christian religion. When they say all of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them, they confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. The author of Hebrews, which is one of the only texts that has a strong argument for a female authorship, is speaking to a people who are colonized within the center of the empire. Sounds like New York. They are colonized in the middle of colonizers' capital city. The word strangers, xenos, from xenophobia, the Greek, and foreigners are specifically chosen by the author to indicate that they have rights somewhere else, in another world where citizenship was for everyone. And so what does it mean for an entire theology to take these scriptures and wrap them around into an idea of American exceptionalism, and to have your humanity based on the inhumanity of others? The title of this sermon comes from the genius of James Baldwin, who wrote near his death, "The price the white American paid for their ticket was to become white. And in the main, nothing more than that. Or, as he was to insist, nothing less. This incredibly limited, not to say dim-witted ambition has choked many a human being to death here. And this, I contend, is because the white American has never accepted the real reasons for the journey." So when we look around and see the tragedies and we see the cycles of violence going on in the world, we have to ask, what is the cost? What has it cost us? What has the American dream cost us? What happens to a people who have caused more violence, colonization, slavery, murder, exploitation, and violence than any other social group in the history of the known world? Do we really think we can go through all that and come out unscathed, untainted? I mean, everyone here would know the suffering that can result from guilt and shame of hurting someone else. When I was 4 years old, I still have a scar, I was playing with a Swiss Army knife and cut my thumb open. And my creative mind managed to blame my mute 2-year-old sister for it. And said that she was playing with it and I was just trying to help her out and save her from the knife. My family bought it and even taught her the word, "I'm sorry." I can still see my poor sister Kate crying and saying sorry, not knowing what it means. But that's another sermon. But the next day, this ate up more than anything that my 4-year-old soul had ever experienced. The next day, which felt like weeks, I confessed to my mom sobbing. So if we think a 4-year-old can have that type of hyper guilt and shame, what about compounded, unacknowledged generational shame and guilt? Guilt that is passed down. Passed down through time, across families. It's in the air we breathe. It's not biological, it's ancestral. And so we, white Christians or people of faith, must come face to face with the cross and the full knowledge that Jesus did not come to deliver the powerful and give them more power. Jesus came standing with and amongst the brutalized people. Jesus fought and suffered to turn the world upside down, to empower those at the margins. And those very powers chose to crucify Jesus for doing this. But in that crucifixion, God shows us that a weapon of torture and death can actually point us towards love, resurrection, justice, where the brutalized are lifted up and the power of the oppressors are proven fragile, hollow compared to the power of God's love. Yes, we need to talk about white privilege, absolutely, but it's deeper than that. That's what I mean by theological. It has to do with how we understand our creation, our very being. I love saying existential because it has so many T's, but it's an existential shivering, as Dr. Cornel West calls it. It is one thing to feel guilty, it's another thing to be guilty. The first is an emotion, it's fleeting, it's seeking forgiveness by a person of color in some strange way, and then the guilt disappears. When white people only feel guilty, our understanding of black people's humanity is always contingent on whether that feeling is satisfied from day to day. But to acknowledge that we are guilty is another thing. It is to be honest about who we are and who Jesus is calling us to be. To acknowledge one's guilt is the first step to affirming the total humanity of those who have been brutalized. This is no easy task. It opens up to guilt's two sinister brothers, shame and embarrassment. And sometimes it does feel like it's hard to believe that things can be different. But they can. In The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin points out to the intellectual and theological advantage of coming from the underside of history. He writes that black people and people of color in the U.S. have the great advantage of having never believed the collection of myths that to which white Americans cling, that their ancestors were all freedom-loving heroes, that they were born in the greatest country the world has ever seen. We have to remember that America is temporal. What's the Angels? That play, I think that's in. America is temporary, mean. It is temporal. It will take a great deal of soul searching to find a place where we are able to understand that this is not our country, that we belong somewhere else. To admit to being strangers, foreigners on this earth is a scary thing. There comes a time when we need to hear the words of Malcolm X, spoke to the young white woman who came to him in Harlem and said, "What as a white person can I do?" And Minister X replied with the last thing we want to hear, white people want to hear. Anyone know, remember what Malcolm said? Nothing. Nothing. But we can't stop there. Because I know that it takes a lot of nothings in my journey as a white man in this nation before I can get any glimpses of the something on the other side. When he wrote the famous lines, Baldwin, "If the concept of God has any validity or any use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, then it is time we got rid of him." Yes, him. It is time we got rid of the white God. It is time we got rid of the God of white supremacy, of patriarchy and transphobia and Islamophobia, of ableism and ageism, because that is not the God of our faith. That God is a heretical God. That is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rahab, David, Jesus, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dr. King, and Malcolm X. That's not the God we want. And it's hard to sometimes to believe it can be different, and this is no time for false optimism. How many of y'all know that? It's not time for false optimisms or platitudes that say things are getting better and, you know, we've come so far, and to pat ourselves on the back. I wish Lila was here. Y'all saw her comment in the discussion last week. But I know it can be different because I've seen it be different. When Erlinda said those words, "It's hard to be different," my mind and my body raced back to December 2009, when I went through 8 months of acute depression. It's important to note that there's the only social group. We know the spiritual perversion that white supremacy has done to white people over history. But now we're seeing the actual physical impacts too. The only social group in this country right now who has an increasing mortality rate is middle-aged white men. This is what I believe Baldwin was talking about with The Fire Next Time. I went through 8 months of acute depression, spending most days staring at the wall of my bedroom, waiting until it was late enough to go to sleep. Has anyone ever really gotten to know their wall? Every little scratch and mark. Where getting out of bed felt like a Herculean, I should write words I can say, Herculean accomplishment, depending on others. Living on what felt like borrowed time. And my mother, at some point in the middle of family dinner with everyone around, looked at me and said, "Rob, I know it doesn't feel like it will be different, but it will." And for those who haven't been in depression before, you can look outside today, and I'll give you another one. It is really hard to imagine that 4 months from now, snowplows will be outside. We'll have plows on the streets. Daniel is storing, I just saw it, went through the building. He's storing our ice salt in the basement right now. But as certain as the changing of the season is God's love for God's people and the salvation that comes to us free and gives us freedom. I think of the joy of friendships where race doesn't become invisibilized but becomes a source of great joy and laughter. I think of the wash towel conversations. All you those in interracial relationships will know about this conversation. A lot of white people don't use washcloths. People start to move away from me, inch away. I think about... I wish we had a camera back here. I know I'm talking about my mom a lot, but I remember when she first found out from a friend of hers, and she was so embarrassed that she went out and bought 4 dozen washcloths, just in case anyone came over, for me and Hershey when we came back. I never use washcloths until I go home now. And actually, the last time we were there, she had lost all 48. I think of just this past week when I saw the gospel lived out by Middle at a theater in Times Square. Jim was there, Jocelyn was there, Beth was there. There was a young white man who was being belligerent because he had the wrong tickets. He had gotten tickets from somewhere to a private screening that they messed up, and he was blaming it on the organizers of the Voices Project, and he was just livid. It was, self-righteous all over. And I watched as not Jim or I, but Jocelyn and Beth stepped in and talked to the young man. And Beth said, "Stop it." If y'all know Beth. And she just said, "Stop it. This is childish. You should listen to the women who are organizing this and give it up." And I said, that is the joy of Middle. And that is the joy of being together. They couldn't have done it nearly as well if it was just Beth or if it was just Jocelyn. But together they were able to diffuse the situation and send those guys packing. I think of Nathan and Daniel sitting around cracking jokes here at Middle. I think of all of you and the friendships that happen at the as the gospel choir or in the hallways. And I know it can be different because I woke up this morning to a post on Facebook that in Belhaven, North Carolina, not far from where that very candidate that I spoke of talked about Second Amendment people, after years of struggle with a white Republican mayor and the NAACP coming together, after 2 marches to D.C. on foot, they are now going to reopen a community hospital that was shut down by corporations 3 years ago. And the legislator... In verse 16, it says, "But as it is, they desire a better country." And the Greek word desire, you can get this on Google. The Greek word desire means to stretch forward to. It's an action. Love is an action. It means to stretch forward to a better country. That is a heavenly one. And therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, God has prepared a city for them. I know it can be different. It can be different because we can be different. And we can be different because God is waiting on us to be different. We might not be ready. We're never ready. Really. I wasn't ready today. But God is ready. Not because we're good or special, but because God is good and thinks we're special. Maybe so. Amen.